2 years ago, the murder of George Floyd exposed for many what Black and Brown communities have long known and experienced, that we must do more to ensure that our nation lives up to its founding promise of fair and impartial justice for all. The incident sparked one of the largest social movements this country has ever seen, with calls from all corners to acknowledge the legacy of systemic racism in our criminal justice system and in our institutions more broadly. Greg Robinson II of Greenwood sat down with the White House's Deputy Counsel for Racial Justice and Equity, Danielle Conley, to learn more about President Biden's historic executive order.
Thank you so much, Ms. Conley, for taking time out. Certainly, we are happy to talk with you today. We've heard the news that President Biden is looking forward to signing the executive order establishing some comprehensive rules for use of force around law enforcement officers. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the executive order and what it is meant to accomplish.
Absolutely. And thanks very much for the opportunity to come talk about this. So look, George Floyd's murder 2 years ago today really was a call to action for all of us to do more to ensure that our country live up to its founding promise of equal justice for all, and then we tackle head on the legacy of systemic racism in our criminal justice system and just in our institutions more broadly. And as a part of that, the president has always been a strong supporter of effective, accountable, community-oriented policing and has pushed for meaningful reform on this front for a long time. As you probably know, he pushed for the passage of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act in the Senate. And when that legislation failed, he promised to do everything in his power to move the needle on meaningful reform, including through executive action, which he'll be doing later today. I think at a high level, the EO will promote accountability, it will raise standards, it will increase transparency through things like data collection, and it will take other steps to reform the criminal justice system. And just to get a little bit specific, to give you some examples of how it does that, one big example here is that it directs the Justice Department to create a national accountability database that will track records of misconduct by federal officers, and federal agencies will have to use it when making hiring and promotion and other personnel decisions. And it'll also be built in a way where state and locals can include their records of misconduct of their law enforcement officers too. Importantly, the EO will ban chokeholds and carotid restraints unless deadly force is authorized, and pretty severely restrict the use of no-knock entries for federal law enforcement officers. It will also, and you mentioned this at the top, it requires new use of force standards for all federal law enforcement agencies. And that's really important because it will be the case that 100,000 plus federal law enforcement officers will only be allowed to use force when no reasonably effective, safe, and feasible alternative appears to exist. And it will also emphasize that those officers need to de-escalate, and it will require law enforcement officers to intervene when they see others engaging in the use of excessive force. So, I think those are just a few of the highlights. It does so much more with respect to both the federal law enforcement agencies and officers, but also to incentivize state and locals to adopt some of the same policies and practices.
And I'm glad you ended there. I do want to turn there. It certainly seems as if the killings of the Breonna Taylors, the Eric Garners, the Terrence Crutchers of the world have influenced this action, as you alluded to. But certainly, particularly here in a city like Tulsa, a lot of the concern is on the local level. I'm wondering if you can dive a little bit deeper into the accountability for local departments and that may exist or that this executive action may lead to?
It's a great question. I do think there are pieces of the executive order that speak to that. So, for example, in order to incentivize state and locals to adopt the kinds of policies and practices that are laid out in the executive order, the executive order directs the Attorney General and other agency heads to look at their grant-making authority and award grants in a manner that promote the policies that are laid out in the executive order. It also has mandates for state and local law enforcement agencies that are participants in federal task forces. They will have to comply with those same rules around the body-worn cameras and the and some of the other requirements that are laid out for federal law enforcement officials. But I do think, what makes this EO particularly significant and historic is that it does directly impact over 100,000 federal law enforcement officers, and it establishes federal law enforcement as a model around the country. Look, we still need Congress to act. We still need Congress to do its job and pass meaningful legislation in this space. But the EO really does take a step and really does move the needle when it comes to these issues. And I think the president believes that in light of the mandates to federal law enforcement and the incentivization for purposes of state and locals, these are really critical steps to enhance public trust more broadly and to strengthen public safety more broadly.
I certainly hear the approach of incentivizing the right sort of action. I'm wondering, how will it affect communities where departments are perhaps hostile to these sorts of oversights and accountability models?
So, I think one of the things that it does is, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to sort of think about the levers that the federal government can use to potentially incentivize state and local law enforcement agencies. And that's a big piece of this. And I can't really emphasize enough how important it is that federal law enforcement be a model for what constitutional policing should look like. And I do think that those things are particularly important. But, just to step back, I think these reforms as a whole, right, aren't about any one case or any one incident. They're not even just about fatal encounters with the police. They're really about finding ways that law enforcement in our broader criminal justice system, where we can promote equitable, accountable, community-oriented policing that serves all of us and increases public safety by building this public trust. Again, it's not a panacea, and the president is still calling for meaningful legislation. But the fact that this executive order has both the support of the law enforcement community, including the Fraternal Order of Police and the International Association of Chiefs of Police, as well as the civil rights community, including the NAACP, the National Urban League, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, as well as the lawyers who have represented families who have been impacted by these incidents, who have been impacted by officer-involved killings. That is a pretty large group of constituents who have all come together and said, yes, this is a step in the right direction.
Yeah. I can't help but think about the countless families that have been impacted by the killings that we've all experienced as a country, particularly coming off of what has happened in our country just yesterday. Would this type of executive order have saved the lives of the George Floyd or Terrence Crutcher or Quadri Sanders?
So again, I think it's hard to talk about this in terms of a particular case or a particular killing, but I do think that the reforms that are mandated by this executive order that again will impact over 100,000 federal law enforcement officers and serve as this model for state and locals, and the fact that with respect to so many of these reforms, the federal government will be providing technical assistance to state and locals who want to get on the right side of this issue. The fact that it has the support of these large policing institutions that represent members of the state and local community who are on board with looking at this as a model, that can I say that it would have made a difference in the life of one individual? No, but can I say that something like this will have a significant impact, from this day forward in light of the support that has been garnered around this? And when these provisions are implemented, yes, it will. And I think, again, we want Congress to do its job too, but we haven't seen police reform like this in decades.
And just as one of the hot button issues that has come up around this issue in totality, and this will be my final question, is does this executive order limit qualified immunity in any way? Does it touch on that subject?
So it does not, the president does not have the authority to limit qualified immunity in any way through executive action. That's something that Congress would have to do.
Thank you so much, Deputy Counsel Conley. I really appreciate that. Is there anything that did not get asked, points that you think are critical to this historic executive order, as you mentioned, that you want to address?
No, I think the only thing that I'll end by saying, other than, I first want to say that our hearts are with all of the people in Texas today after that horrible tragedy yesterday. And, I think of not just that incident, but so many incidents as calls to action. And I think that when we think about the murder of George Floyd 2 years ago and what we all saw and how that was a call to action for us to really, really come together because change was needed, that this executive order is the product of that. I just think it's worth reiterating that the president's action today has the support of leaders in the law enforcement community, the civil rights community, the families of impacted individuals, people who lost their lives, right? And everyone is in agreement that change is needed here, and this EO helps to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It is certainly a step forward. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.